Good morning, everyone, and welcome to NCSL's Policy 101 on unemployment insurance. I am Michael Quillen, and I am joined by my colleagues John Jacuri and Zach Herman. A few things before we get started with the presentation. I would like to ask everyone to share in the chat box which state you are from. And as you are doing that, I will add that today's presentation not only will be recorded, but will also be published on our State Policy 101 landing page. And I will provide that link in the chat box as well. So with that, let's jump right in. So first and foremost, what is unemployment insurance? Well, unemployment insurance, or as we call UI, is a state-provided insurance that pays money to individuals on a weekly basis when they lose their job and meet certain eligibility requirements. Typically, those who have either quit their job or were fired for a just cause are not eligible for UI benefits. However, someone who was separated from their job due to the lack of available work and was at no fault of their own can usually still qualify for unemployment benefits. The UI programs are structured as a partnership between federal government, states, and territories. States and territories set the parameters of the unemployment programs within federal guidelines, including payroll taxes, tax rates, and wage bases for covered workers. Each state's unemployment insurance taxes are paid by employers and are remitted to the federal UI trust fund, where each state has a separate account for covering normal unemployment insurance benefits. The basic program in most states provides up to 26 weeks of benefits to unemployed workers, which is equivalent to replacing about half of their previous wages on average. In terms of funding mechanisms, states provide most of the funding and the federal government only pays the administrative costs. One important aspect that is worth mentioning to everyone is that although states are subject to few federal requirements, they are generally able to set their own eligibility criteria and benefit levels. So the short-time compensation programs, also known as STC, they're also known as work sharing or shared work programs. It's an alternative to layoffs for employers who are experiencing a reduction in available work. These STC programs preserve jobs and trained workers during times of economic downturn, or in our specific case currently, a pandemic. STC allows employers to reduce hours of work for employees rather than laying them off, ultimately averting layoffs and ensuring that these workers will be able to resume to prior employment levels when business demand increases again. So for these employees that do experience a reduction in hours, if they're determined eligible, may collect a certain percentage of unemployment insurance benefits to replace a portion of their lost wages. Currently, as you can see in the map, there are 26 states that have active STC programs. The Federal Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund serves three primary functions. One, it finances the cost of administering unemployment insurance programs. Two, it serves as a loan to state unemployment insurance funds. And three, it also serves as a cushion for providing half of extended benefits during periods of high unemployment. So where does this money come from? Well, there's a 6% federal payroll tax known as Federal Unemployment Tax Act, or FUTA. This FUTA tax is levied on the first $7,000 of covered workers' earnings. Employers remit the tax, but can claim credits against the 5.4 percentage points of FUTA taxes paid in states' unemployment programs that meet the federal standards, which are currently all the states. So the effective FUTA tax rate thus shrinks to 0.6%, or a maximum of $42 per worker. So how does the federal trust fund differ in the states? Well, they sort of operate in the same capacity. The federal fund is used to cover administrative expenses or make loans to states that deplete their own reserves and cover half of extended unemployment benefits of periods of high unemployment. States cover the other half. States now can borrow from the federal fund if their own reserves are insufficient. And for some context, during the Great Recession, when there was a long period of high unemployment, state UI reserves were hit particularly hard. 36 states borrowed from the federal fund. It's also worth highlighting that the Department of Labor reported at the start of this year that unemployment funds of 22 states and territories were below the recommended minimum solvency level, while the other 31 states' accounts met or exceeded the minimum. Under the FFCRA, which we will discuss in a bit, it waived the interest accrued in Title VII loans from March to December of 2022. So for states that borrow from the federal government to pay UI benefits, interest will start accruing in January of this year, 2021. And if states do not repay the loans before November of 2022, employers may potentially see a higher food taxes in January of 2023. So I know there's a lot of information on this slide, and I know it's a lot to take in. So I wanted to provide key takeaways from it. First being from the screenshot that you see on the right, the Department of Labor regularly updates the amount of money that states are taking out as loans from the federal government. That information is provided on this website that you see. And it also includes on this site, you can have access to weekly claims reports, reports on Title VII advances, and even yearly state tax data. So now, the first stimulus package that Congress passed was the CARES Act, which was signed into law on March 27th. It provided several initiatives that increased individuals' UI entitlements, including allowing states to temporarily expand eligibility guidelines for unemployment benefits and increase the weekly benefit amount by $600 until July 31st of 2020. To be clear, that is $600 on top of what a state was currently paying an individual. In addition to providing expanded benefits, the Act also allowed individuals who traditionally did not qualify for UI benefits to now receive them, such as self-employed workers, independent contractors, and gig economy workers. So to sum up what the CARES Act was or did in one sentence, it stood up additional unemployment programs, provided additional money to individuals, and expanded access to those who were historically left out of receiving them in the past. So now, in the most recent stimulus package passed on December 28th, PUA, FPUC, and PEUC, all of these extended unemployment benefits were extended through March 14th of this year, 2021, providing essential relief to workers who are in danger of losing all of their crucial benefits at the end of 2020. So not only did the package provided crucial extensions to these programs, it also increased the maximum number of weeks an individual can claim for a combination of state and federal UI benefits, from 39 weeks to 50 weeks. And the number of weeks an individual may claim through PEUC has been extended from 13 weeks to 24 weeks. As my colleague John will allude to more in a minute, we anticipate Congress again extending these benefits to individuals in the near future. So before we move to the next slide and hear from my colleague John, I wanted to remind everyone, as you're still coming in and getting adjusted to all these slides and soaking everything in, to please type any question you may have around unemployment insurance, trust funds, or UI funding in the chat box, and myself or my colleagues are happy to answer them. So now, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I can move on to the next slide here. As Michael mentioned, I also work out of our DC office with NCSL, and I'm focusing on state and federal relations additionally. And I want to provide a little bit of a deeper dive into what the outlook is like here in our nation's capital for UI benefits. And then I also want to share some of the UI trust fund data we've been tracking on. So first off, let's discuss the current situation with the proposal submitted by the Biden administration and what is currently being crafted on Capitol Hill. Throughout the pandemic and the number of federal economic relief responses that have been pushed out to the states, NCSL has been in close communication with leadership in both the House and the Senate. And we've helped provide congressional and state briefings around unemployment insurance, along with some of the other labor provisions that have been included. Also, very importantly, we've worked with several coalition groups closely with the National Governors Association, the Association of State Workforce Agencies, as well as groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Employment Law Project, amongst others. It's clearly evident that unemployment issues facing our country is a bipartisan issue. Now, as far as the most recent stimulus proposal is concerned right now, through budget reconciliation, folks on the Hill have been working on clearing the way for the Biden administration to push through another economic relief package here. The current plan in the House of Representatives is calling for an extension of the pandemic unemployment programs that were mentioned by Michael, along with providing a $400 a week enhanced UI benefit that would run through August 29th of this year. As it was stated earlier, currently we have a $300 enhanced weekly UI benefit that expires here on March 14th, which is kind of the goalpost for getting this next package through Congress. It also contains $350 billion of funding for state and local governments. 60% of that would be allocated directly to states, while 40% would go to local governments. And if folks want to discuss a bit more around the next stimulus proposal, we can dive into that a bit more during the Q&A. But for now, let's go ahead and jump into a closer look at what states are doing about funding their UI trust funds with the next slide here. And when looking through this, through these statistics, I should mention, please keep in mind, I mean, there's still more than 10 million Americans that are without jobs here, and that's over 4.4 million higher than before the pandemic began just about 1 year ago. Also, there should be a question in the chat box, hopefully, and as you're looking at this slide and the next one, if you don't see your state listed, please let us know if your state might be planning to take out a federal UI loan, or if you're aware of your state planning to use what might be left of last year's federal funding, the coronavirus relief funding that went out to states under CARES, if you're planning to use that to support your UI trust fund. We're certainly aware of a few states that have already been given advanced authorization to take out UI loans, but it's always great to hear from folks that are actually on the ground in state houses. As you can imagine, trying to track all this information can be difficult at times, and your feedback's welcome and appreciated in the chat here. So upon looking at this slide, we currently, again, are roughly 1 year into the economic fallout from the pandemic, and 23 states have been utilizing or have utilized federal COVID relief funds for their state UI trust funds. There's also 20 states that have taken out interest-free loans for their UI trust funds. If you want to move on to the next slide, you can also see what states are using interest-free loans for them. And then upon looking at the previous slide and this one, we also know that California, Georgia, Hawaii, Louisiana, New Mexico, Virginia, and West Virginia are all currently utilizing both their CRF dollars for their trust fund, as well as having taken out a federal loan to support their UI trust fund. At the present time, states have utilized almost $7 billion for their federal COVID relief funds to be used for their UI trust funds. Additionally, as you can see here from the map, once you add up all these numbers, we know that states have taken out close to $50 billion in federal UI trust funds as of right now. And as Michael mentioned earlier, during the Great Recession, around 36 states borrowed money from the feds for their unemployment insurance trust funds. So just to try to piggyback on that and put it in a somewhat of a recent or historical context, clearly, I mean, this is going to be a massive issue for states' budgets moving forward. But again, during that Great Recession, We also know that about 31 states became essentially UI insolvent. They borrowed in excess of $35 billion from the feds during that time. And that resulted in repayment of their trust funds with interest added on, having to increase payroll taxes during a weakened economy, and caused an incentive to reduce benefits by lowering the duration of benefits in some cases. So once again, keep in mind, states are currently over $50 billion in debt to the federal government for their UI trust funds. And there's going to be more states that continue to take out loans as far as we can tell. And as you can also see, states that are borrowing, utilizing federal dollars, this is a national issue. This is not solely a red, blue, purple state issue. It's a national predicament. Again, with at least over 10 million plus people continuing to need this jobless assistance, we are confident these pandemic unemployment programs will be extended into the fall once they are set to expire again here March 14th, with another round of economic relief likely to pass towards the end of the month, or hopefully by early March at the latest, we think. So keeping that in mind, I also would like to reiterate our thanks to all of you again for joining us on this session today. As you continue to work in our state houses throughout the US, please let us all know whenever we can be of assistance. And after we hear from our colleague, Zach, who's out in Denver, we're happy to try and address any questions around this information and presentation that you might have, or also feel free to follow up with us at a later point in time, or if you're watching a recorded version of this later, please feel free. So I'll stop my remarks there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Michael. So my name is Zach Herman, and I work in our Employment, Labor, and Retirement program here in the Denver office. And I'm going to talk about how COVID-19 has affected how states are managing and thinking about their unemployment programs. It's not an understatement to say that COVID-19 has made significant changes and produced some significant upheaval to how states manage and think about their unemployment compensation programs. So you can go ahead, go to the next slide. So before we talk about what states are currently doing, I think it's important to set the stage about how we sort of got where we are now. So in 2019, 31 states had trust fund solvency levels at or above recommended levels. So that means that the states had enough money, 31 states had enough money in their trust funds to cover the amount of total payments that were done over the last 3 recessions. Then 22 states were below the recommended solvency levels. No states, aside from the Virgin Islands, have outstanding debts from Title 12 advances related to their trust funds. And we're sitting at historically low unemployment at around 3.2, 3.4%. Then coming into March of 2020, COVID hits when we have our first wave of lockdowns, and everything changes. So in that second half of March, I'm pretty sure most of us have seen through news reports where the initial weekly claims went from around 300,000 new claims a week to almost 15 million. The graph looks like the line goes almost straight up. That's a historic volume of new claims per week. For an example, in the 2008-2009 recession, peak new weekly claims topped out at around 1.2 million. And then in the first week of the recession related to COVID, we saw 15 million. It's unprecedented in the amount of volume of claims that states had to manage through. Then on top of that, there were a slew of new federal programs that changed how unemployment functions that were also introduced that states had to adapt to. So that includes the FPUC, which is the extra $600 a week that is currently $300. The $600 expired in July. The PUA, Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, which is the gig worker funding. So traditionally, gig workers and independent contractors do not qualify for unemployment insurance, and PUA through the CARES Act gave them a pathway for unemployment insurance, as well as a slew of other extended benefits programs and a bunch of new federal funding mechanisms. These new programs were all 100% federally funded. So states had to not only ramp up their capacity to manage all of these new wave of claims, they also had to build out these new programs. So states worked through that in 2020. Now in 2021, states continue to have high rates of new weekly applications. We're seeing it hover around either 800,000 to 1 million new claims a week. And those are new claims, not continuing claims or claims that have already been submitted. And again, that was the peak we saw in the Great Recession. So new initial claims still remain very high. 19 states have outstanding debts related to their trust funds. Multiple states are experiencing millions of dollars in fraud. That's both overpayments generally and fraud specifically. And then every state has a backlog of claims. Some states are doing better than others, but no state is getting 100% of their first payments out in 2 to 3 weeks after that initial application is submitted. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So first, we're going to talk about program changes that happened because of in 2020 and in 2021 related to coronavirus. So all 50 states implemented PUA, and that's still ongoing. All 50 states in 2020 waived or modified, or not waived their waiting week. 8 states did not have a waiting week. So pre-COVID, 42 states had a waiting week where after you were approved, you had to wait 1 week before you got your first weekly payment. All 50 states waived or modified their work search requirements. That's continuing to change now as sort of guidelines and recommendations are changing, both from the federal government and the state level in terms of who can look for work. But initially, especially in the beginning of the pandemic and lockdowns, all states had either waived or modified those work search requirements. 27 states waived or modified their employer experience ratings related to COVID-19. So that's an additional calculation states do for an additional tax on employers if they've had multiple employees claim unemployment insurance in the past year. And then 20 states have currently taken out loans related to trust fund solvency. Then on the administrative level, there are about 5 or 6 strategies that states have been using to expand their capacity to manage the volume of claims and to address the backlog. So there's been increased staffing. So that's directly hiring new people to go into their unemployment program to manage claims, to process applications and things like that. There was grant money from the CARES Act to help that process move forward. Staggering or scheduling when applicants can apply. If you've got a state, you've got a way that they're staggering those things. It could be last name, date of birth, social security number, what have you, but basically making it so that they stagger and spread out when the claims are coming in so that they're not getting all 800,000 on the first Monday of the month. Contracting with call centers to help expand their call center capacities because people have lots of questions. And so they can divert the general application questions to the call centers. And then the questions specifically related to either an appeal or a certification requirement or something like that can go to the staff specifically. Utilizing other staff from other programs. This was especially common during the lockdowns when furloughed government employees had no other work to do. They would be brought into the Department of Labor to help manage those claims. Technological improvements writ large. There have been several grants and funding streams from the federal government to help states improve their technological capacity. So this can be implementing chatbots, new emails, expanding server capacity, all those sorts of things. And then finally, we've seen an increasing pattern of states using short-time compensation, the 26 that have it statutorily, to divert some of the people who would otherwise be new applicants into the short-time compensation program instead of having them just get regular unemployment when they're furloughed. So we can go to the next slide. So then also talking about fraud. It was a Secret Service report that happened in the latter part of 2020, talking about the significant fraud that was happening in the unemployment system. The bulk of that was happening through PUA. The requirements for PUA are a little bit more sort of nebulous. And because the system is so new, it's harder to have those established guidelines for checking. And so the bulk of that was happening through PUA. There are 2 main sort of streams of how these overpayments or fraudulent payments are happening. The first one is organized crime and identity theft. So the Secret Service report outlines several sort of overseas organized crime rings that were using fraudulent identities and stolen identities to apply for either regular benefits or PUA benefits to receive unemployment payments. And then there's also the other stream, which is new applicants making errors on their applications. So with 15 million new people and 1 million people, generally 1 million people a week applying, you're going to have people who've never applied to unemployment insurance ever, and they're going to make mistakes on their applications. you can look at the data from the Department of Labor to sort of see those specifics in there as well. States have taken two sort of strategies to address both of those things. So the first one, to address the organized fraud, about 5 to 8 states have implemented specific ID checking, either using ID.me or their own identity checking service to double check that these identities are names and social security numbers that are being submitted on applications are correct and they're not a stolen identity. And other states like Washington and Colorado have been partnering with the Realtors Association in their state to make sure that addresses submitted on applications are not addresses of listed homes, which was another strategy used to commit fraud. Then on the overpayment side, there have been a variety of strategies, including making very public documents and flow sheets about how to fill out your application, simplifying or making the language on applications more clear, implementing those chat bots and call centers to help people with applications, producing videos about how to fill out your application to make sure you fill it out correctly. And then most recently, we've seen a bill in Missouri where levels of overpayments for people who made errors on their applications unintentionally will not necessarily be held responsible for those overpayments. They may not necessarily be required to pay back those overpayments. We've also seen technological improvements. There is a specific grant from the Department of Labor for states to improve their technological capacity to address fraud, increasing the general staff training, expanding reporting systems through either NASWA, the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, and their Integrity Center to sort of cross-examine applicants if fraudulent applications are happening in multiple states. And also just expanding reporting systems generally to make sure that there are multiple eyes seeing these applications to make sure that they're trying to catch as many red flags as possible. And we can move on to the next slide. So then looking ahead into this year, 2022 and beyond, there are multiple things that states are paying attention to. So currently, until the new round of stimulus is passed, all federal supplemental funding will expire in March. So the PUA, the extra $300 a week, the federally funded extended benefits, all of that is currently set to expire in March. Then unemployment is likely to remain high, even though it's not as high as the Congressional Budget Office initially projected at the beginning of the recession. It's still likely to remain around 7 or 8%, which is about the peak of the Great Recession. It's likely to remain around that level for the rest of the year. PUA, the gig worker program, expires on March 14th. And then in 2022, all states that have not completely paid off their outstanding Title 12 advances will see an automatic FUTA tax increase. It is functionally a credit reduction or a credit reduction, and that the level of that credit reduction will reduce. And it functions as a tax increase at the federal level for the first $7,000 on salary. And so those are all sort of things that the states are thinking about, how to manage this funding and these new programs and all of those other sorts of things. And so we can then move on to the next slide and address some questions. And so let me check and see, we've got some questions coming in. Yes, so we talked about the fraud a little bit. We'd love to hear more about Missouri's work to address overpayments, who unintentionally made errors. So the bill is currently in the first committee, and it's a bunch of different bills that they're going to try to put together into one bill, but it's looking at a variety of strategies to examine what level of error is or is not considered sort of fraudulent or like an error, just an error in the application. And then they're also looking at either how that forgiveness will happen. Will they only forgive maybe 50% of the overpayment, 75% of the overpayment? Will they forgive all of it and then use CRF funds to cover the state's losses? Those sorts of things. So it's all still pretty nebulous right now, just sitting in first committee. But that's the general idea, is they're looking at if a person made an error and received an overpayment unintentionally or non-fraudulently without the intention of fraud, then they will not necessarily be held liable to pay back those overpayments. And we're sort of interested to see where it goes from there once it sort of gets debated in committee and moves forward and stuff like that. Then other questions, we see one that's related to how states are thinking about paying back their trust fund and those trust fund loans. I think it's important to note that from the 38 billion that states took out from the 2008 recession, it took about a decade to have all of those Title 12 advances paid back. So it wasn't until 2019, 2020, that we saw no states no longer having those Title 12 advances. And so even with the advances being interest-free, currently, it's still sort of something that we think states should be paying attention to and are paying attention to and thinking about how to get these funds paid back. Several states are also considering currently suspending their state level tax increases. So several states have mechanisms in statutes where the state level unemployment taxes will ramp up as either their debt ramps up or their employment levels ramp up. And several states are considering suspending that because it sort of harms businesses when revenue is already suppressed in the pandemic economy right now. And so that's another sort of interesting thing because that mechanism is built in there to help states pay back that trust fund. And so we're curious to see how that's going to work as well. I think states like Maryland and Maryland's the one that comes to mind is sort of currently considering that. Then let's see, any other questions? We have a question for John and Michael. Sort of what are the important things that you should pay attention to or think about in the coming federal stimulus?
Sure. I think the biggest thing for states is going to be more increased flexibility for the direct funding that comes in this time around is our hope. As I mentioned, the current proposal includes $350 billion for state and local governments. And also, as we mentioned, it includes the extension of the pandemic UI programming, the $400 enhanced payment rather than the $300 enhanced payment that would be extended through August 29th. There's also $2 billion of new funding for UI program integrity and provides grants for states to make some infrastructure investments potentially. And again, as the proposal exists right now, the direct funding for states does appear to be a little bit more flexible compared to the previous packages, especially because there's no date and time that would require states to spend the money by as of now. So the funds could be used until they're entirely expended by a state. And then I should also mention if any state's still sitting on what's left of their funding from last year, that's also been extended out until the end of this year, the end of 2021, until they need to spend the money by. So both these things that I think are huge positives and wins for states as far as flexibility is concerned. Thanks.
Thank you, John. We have another question. Have we found that state workforce agencies had emergency planning procedures for how to address the surge in claims? John or Michael, do you want to take that one? If not, I can take it.
I'm not fluent in that, so if you want to give a crack at it, Zach, go for it, or something we can also follow up on if need be.
Yeah, I'm happy to follow up with more specifics. We don't know of any specific emergency planning procedures related to surges in claims. States generally know recessions are coming and so have these things in here. I think what's important to note is that the volume and speed in which these new initial claims happened is truly unpredictable, unprecedented. Going from 300 new initial claims a week across the nation to 15 million is staggering. And so I think that was sort of an important thing to take note of when thinking about emergency procedures is that just isn't something you would think would happen. And then that sort of, even with the leveling off, maintaining those levels of new rates of applications sitting at the peak, sitting at 1 million, which was the peak for the Great Recession, is also sort of unprecedented. So I think the volume is really historic, and that's also something to consider when thinking about state preparedness and if they could have even been Then we have another question about, let's see, tax strategies. So we're not really seeing too much specifically related to that. It's still sort of early on, and states are not sort of giving us a whole lot of information about that one way or the other. I think states are themselves thinking about that as well. And then it looks like we sort of don't have any more questions coming.
I would just close by saying one last thing in regards to the kind of what's going on in Congress here and the next relief package is concerned. Under the current proposal, the interest-free waiver we had mentioned for federal UI trust fund loans would expire at the end of August in this current proposal, which means that states would still have to make their interest payments this year. There are other kind of workforce-centric groups that are advocating and pushing for Congress to make that extension all the way until September 30th of 2022. So we'll just have to see what happens there, and we'll certainly be keeping everyone posted moving forward. Yeah, if there's nothing else. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in today.